welcome to another video where we talk about stuff you wouldn't even normally talk about. Recently, people started talking about all the possible VGUs that might appear soon. That's because almost a year ago, Reeve gave us the list of champions that Riot is currently looking at. But a lot of these listed champions were either already announced or were already updated. So right now, it is much easier to guess who will be next. What people may not realize, however, is that it is 3 times as easy for people who read the lore. Those of you who are updated on the latest story events may instantly recognize some familiar faces on this list. But because some members of our community tend to read only the stories they are interested in, I want to cover every single one of these listed champions, and I want to go even further beyond them. So, in this video we will talk about champions that look different in the lore, champions that have to get an update for one reason or another, and I want to discuss which one of the listed champions will actually be next. So, let's get on it. Let's start with the simple side. Let's have a look at the champions who are so old they have to get a visual update. There aren't many of them these days, but we still have a few that carry the same model all the way from the release version of League of Legends. The reason why you probably can't tell that some champions didn't change from their original version in 2010 is because Riot is really good at masking their low polygon count with detailed textures. It looks like Mundo is just fine, but in reality he's a blocky mess. So, going in alphabetical order. The first one would have to be Amumu. His model is really old at this point, and his animations are the same he used in the beta version of League of Legends. Then we have Blitzcrank. His model is incredibly outdated, and his animations might be one of the worst in the game right now. What's interesting though is that Rory Elderton totally avoided updating his walk cycle. It could be either because Blitzcrank's run animation is really iconic for him, or because Riot is already working on a VGU for Blitzcrank, and updating his old animations now wouldn't make sense. I wanted to say that Brand isn't doing too well either, but his design is simple and the burnt textures hide the low details well. Also, Brand's design didn't change at all in the semi-recent Rise comic, so I don't think Riot will be updating him now. Cho'Gath on the other hand has to be coming at any moment. His model is really outdated, his animations are really choppy, and he doesn't really have a place in the lore yet. He's a perfect candidate for the next update. Mundo is still using his old model, and his new textures can't really keep him in line with the others. The only reason why I don't think that Riot is going to update him soon is because he just got a brand new Q animation. I don't think Riot would update his animations if they knew he would be reworked entirely soon. Fiddlesticks is on the same level as Cho'Gath. He is just incredibly old, and design-wise he isn't really that interesting. The only reason why Fiddlesticks looks fine in-game is because he's just a bunch of sticks and straw. Even if you make a low-resolution tree branch, it would still look like a tree branch. So I think the reason why Fiddlesticks looks fine is because his design is very simple. Gragas on the other hand is too simple. His model is really old, and he has nothing to make him stand apart. He's just a plumpy guy with a barrel. Jarvan is also pretty old. In fact, his model is so old it doesn't even feel like he fits into the game. There is no way Riot will keep him the way he is now. Jax is kind of in the same place. The only reason why Jax is fine is because he gets new animations every now and then. He recently got new auto attack animations that will keep him fresh for the next few years. Kog'Maw is quite hilarious. His design doesn't even fit into the game anymore, let alone the story, so he has to be coming soon, just like Cho'Gath. Leblanc isn't in a terrible state, but the age of her model is getting evident, and the animations are quite simple too. Lee Sin is incredibly hilarious. Just, what is human anatomy, right? I know leg days are not that popular, but maybe don't focus on your arms if this is what your muscles look like. Malphite is just Malphite. There is not much I have to say here, just look at him. Nocturne is in a strange place, because he's nothing but a black floating blob. He looks fine, but if you look closely you may notice how horrible he looks. Surprisingly, Olaf is also using his old original model. Especially if you compare him to other humans, you may notice how blocky his arms really are. And if you have a look at some of his newer skins, you may notice how his arms should look like in reality, because his new skins updated the entire model. Pantheon is exactly the same. He looks fine, but only if you don't look at anyone else. I mean, really, look at his feet. His toes are bigger than his head. Orianna looks somewhat fine because she's a robot. Metal parts are supposed to look choppy and sharp, so her old model aged really well. And while Rumble is also mostly robotic, his Yordle part isn't doing that well. Shaco looks fine only because he's supposed to be partially humorous, so his weird animations kinda save him. With that said, he recently got new running animations, so Shaco will likely stay like this for a while. Skarner is just a bunch of crystals fused together, so his old blocky model is fine. That's exactly what crystals are supposed to look like. Teemo hasn't really aged well when compared to other Yordles, especially if you put him next to Tristana or Heimerdinger. He looks terrible. Ironically, Udyr has the Lee Sin syndrome. I am pretty sure that is not what muscles look like. And the last one I want to mention is Zilean. I mean, his beard is one solid piece, and he still technically has only 3 fingers. They need to do something with him. So as you can see, that's quite a list of champions that could use an update. But while some of them need it only because they look horrible, others need a visual update because they look different in the story, and they simply don't represent themselves in the game anymore. So now, I want to have a look at those champions that are currently disconnected from their story, which means that we know that they will get an update. First of all, let's talk about the recent additions, Volibear and Udyr. Udyr is the easier to explain. The story called Silence for the Damned revealed what Udyr's real abilities are, but it also revealed what he looks like now. Spoiler alert, he looks pretty much exactly the same. But when the day of his visual rework arrives, 2 things will have to change. First of all, Udyr is supposed to be a strange guy, the kind of weird person who goes shopping for milk at midnight. There is no reason to think that he is not a normal man, but there's something odd about him. The reason why Udyr is an odd fellow is because his head is full of animal thoughts. That's because he can understand animals and he can talk to them. His new animations should reflect that somehow. I mean, his current animations are, well, without a character, so it can only go up from there. But the second thing that will have to change on Udyr are his abilities. In the story, he can change stances between a lot more animals than just the 4 he has now. We also know that he can shift into a lynx, eagle, iron boar, and even Ornn's ram. But the interesting part is that the shifting should behave more like actual shifting. Right now in the game, Udyr is just changing fighting stance. But according to his lore, he should be turned into the actual animal when cycling through forms. The thing is that since we know that Udyr has around 18 or 20 different animal forms, I wonder how will Riot tackle this issue in game. My idea is that maybe Udyr will be able to pick a set of 4 stances from base. So that maybe he starts the game with something like bear, tiger, eagle and ram, but when he gets into late game he might swap the bear and ram for turtle and boar. Obviously there would have to be a cooldown to swap the set of abilities, but balancing is a whole another issue. Either way, we know that Udyr's gameplay will have to also change. As I mentioned, the second recently showcased champion is Volibear. Now Volibear is currently in a limbo of theories. His story is so twisted and insane, quite literally I'm afraid, that we don't really know what Volibear is supposed to look like. We know he's a great battle bear, and as far as we know, he shouldn't look too different from what he looks like now. The only difference is that he should be much less fluffy, and a lot more bloody. He's a god that's also called a 1000-pierced bear. That's because he's been in so many wars. His bag has hundreds of swords, spears and axes stuck in it. But that's not all. The newest story gave us a look at the Volibear. At least that's what the shapeshifters call him in the north. Now, in the same story that featured Udyr, we also saw the avatar of Volibear. The issue is that we don't actually know if we saw the actual Volibear we have in the game, or if it was just a follower of Volibear's religion, who was twisted into his image. But either way, if you think about it, the story hints at Volibear's future gameplay update. First of all, from the visual side, Volibear will probably look a lot more like a beast from a horror movie. The avatar of Volibear that we saw was a hybrid of a Great War bear and some kind of dark twisted goop. The bear only had half of his face, with the other half being just his revealed skull with dripping black blood all around it. He also had a dozen eyes, which heavily suggests that Volibear might have been touched by the void. But the thing that is connected to his gameplay is his regeneration. At the end of his story, Volibear was sitting in a ritual shrine surrounded by human sacrifices. While he was there, his flesh was regenerating, and at the end his face fully regrew over the skull. I think that is a hint at his passive. When he gets low on health, he gets a burst of healing. I think that when Volibear gets reworked, you'll be able to visually see the damage on him. The lower he is on health, the more you will be able to see the black twisted form beneath his skin. And of course, when he gets near death, it all grows back. The thunder abilities will likely stay as well. Throughout the entire story, not only was there a massive storm that was constantly following him, but when Volibear was in his damaged state, lightning was shooting out of his eyes and mouth. So we know that part will also stay similar. Those were the recently revealed champions, but we got a lot more characters that look different in the lore. The one we mentioned in the last video is Nocturne. While Nocturne remained pretty much exactly the same, there was one tiny change worth mentioning. Nocturne is supposed to have a mouth, and the mouth is supposed to hold a bunch of crooked teeth. This is interesting because up until now, Nocturne never had a mouth, no matter where you looked at him. It was always just a head with eyes. In fact, the only version of him that has a mouth is the Ravaged Nocturne skin. But besides the mouth, his body and the blades should stay the same. The only real addition to Nocturne is that he's more focused on nightmares now. He has the ability to twist your dreams, which is something that might be reflected in his potential future rework. Another champion with just a tiny change is Pantheon. During the very first update of the new universe, Pantheon appeared on Runeterra in his newest form. Before Pantheon ascended Mount Targon, he was a warrior of the Rakor, and the Rakoran warriors look differently from what you would expect. I understand that this looks quite epic, but this is what the real warriors actually look like. But don't expect Pantheon looking like this in the future. Every time someone gets ascended, their overall appearance changes. For example, this is how Tarek looked when he was climbing up, and this is who he became. So with Pantheon, I wouldn't question how this person turned into this person. What's important is how his short story described him. Pantheon is supposed to be armed with Rakoran spear and shield. Now, I am pretty sure this is not a sigil of a Targonian tribe, so I expect both the shield and the spear to change drastically. But by far the most noticeable change is his cape. The cape he is wearing is supposed to imitate the night sky full of stars. It's supposed to have starlight gleaming and sparkling from it. Much like you can see void magic inside Kassadin's blade, Pantheon's cape should have stars shining through it. The interesting thing is that Pantheon was the very first champion that Riot described differently from what they look like in the game. If Pantheon is reworked and his cape gets more astral form, it would be the very first story to hint a visual update. That is unless you count Gangplank, who wasn't really teased that way. It was more like the story was tailored to the rework. The next one we should talk about is Xerath. Now in the story, there isn't anything that would suggest that Xerath shouldn't look like the Xerath we have. But the design we have right now is still the old design bound to the old story. This Xerath is still the old mage who was addicted to rune magic. In fact, he was so much into rune magic he surrendered his body to it. Much like Rise, but in a much greater form. It was about 2 years later that Riot decided to bind his story to Azir, which wasn't a bad idea, but it left us with this abomination that doesn't fit into Shurima. Not only is lightning magic quite rare in Shurima in general, in fact I don't think I've heard about anyone else besides Xerath using lightning magic in the desert, but his design doesn't fit into the region either. According to the canon lore, after Xerath betrayed Azir, he was locked inside his sarcophagus by Nasus and Renekton, but Xerath was able to break its seals, and he was still dangerous. So Nasus had to leave Renekton with Xerath inside his tomb to make sure that Xerath would be sealed away. The problem with this is that they were supposed to be using Shuriman devices to lock Xerath away, and in Shurima, everything is brown, yellow or gold. Even Shuriman medals are gold or bronze colors. So Xerath shouldn't really be bound in ruining blue chains and silver shell. If anything, his guardian skin is a much better representation of what he should actually look like. But I wonder if Riot ever decides to fix this. Because honestly, Xerath doesn't look too bad for an 8-year-old champion. But Xerath isn't the only 8-year-old champion that definitely should get a rework. We also have Jarvan, who was released a couple of months earlier. Jarvan's story doesn't really mention anything new. In fact, his story never mentions his appearance at all. So how do we know that Jarvan is definitely getting a rework? Well, if you open up the map of Runeterra and you head into Demacia, by scrolling down through the military, you may stumble upon Jarvan IV. But hey, this one looks different. That's because yellow armor with spikes isn't very Demacian, and in fact, that's not what he should look like. So when Jarvan's rework finally arrives, just keep in mind that he will look more like this. A proper prince or king protected by silver Demacian steel. When it comes to his weapon, it was never mentioned in the story, and we don't have a picture of it here. So we legitimately have no idea what his weapon even is right now. And speaking of Jarvan, why don't we have a look at Leblanc? Curiously enough, we don't know what Leblanc looks like in the story at all. She's a pale lady that is constantly covered in dark robes. No one has any idea who she is or what she looks like. So when it comes to Leblanc, Riot can go absolutely wild with her design in the future. Maybe they plan to unmask her in the future and tie it to her rework. But as of right now, she may look exactly like what she does in the game, or she may be scrapped entirely. One interesting thing is that the story never mentions the pale lady holding a staff, and especially the staff she has in the game would be really hard to hide under her robes. What we do know is that she has the ability to conjure illusion versions of herself, so even in the story she can create clones to influence her surroundings. But again, when it comes to her design, Riot can go wild. Before we go back to the list given to us by Reef, I also want to mention Zed. Now the story doesn't mention any changes, and as far as we know, Zed should stay the same. My only problem is that his head looks very inappropriate. I mean, his head does look like a head. Not the one you would expect though. Like seriously, how did this go through all the stuff unnoticed? Anyway, the real reason why I'm talking about Zed is because Riot teased his new design. Now this new design might not make it into the game, because it was made for the upcoming comic book. Just like we had a series about Ashe, we are getting a book about Zed. So this design might be turned into a skin instead, but I still wanted to at least mention it here. And the last bonus rework I wanted to talk about is Malphite. I don't really know what to say here. It is speculated that Malphite will be turned into a mountain, which wouldn't be impossible, but his design wouldn't likely change much. I just want to say that I actually like the alien version of Malphite more than the original. If Riot turned Odyssey Malphite into his canon version somehow, I would be fine with it. But before we close this video, let's go back to the list of VGUs, and let's have a look at those who are likely getting a rework next. As you can see, the image was taken from a Reddit post, where they talked about Kayle, Nunu and Mordekaiser. All of them were already released or announced. If you ask me, the story doesn't specify Mordekaiser's appearance, so Riot can honestly do whatever they want. But, simply looking at the champion pictures, you can notice that we already talked about most of them. Not only that, 4 of them should get a rework based on the story, and 2 of them got their stories updated to fit the new appearance less than a month ago. So as of right now, it is safe to assume that Riot is already working on Udyr and Volibear after Mordekaiser. Those 2 will likely be their priority. But what about the rest? Going from left to right. Mundo recently got a new animation. I don't think Riot would update him if they had a rework scheduled. Corki isn't in a horrible state, so I think he's fine. Cho'Gath and later Kog'Maw are in a bad spot. The Voidborn creatures are totally different according to the lore, so both of them need some kind of rework to fit into the new universe. On top of that, both of their animations are also pretty bad. Fiddlesticks is almost the same, and he is also likely higher on the list. I don't think Kennen is currently being worked on because he looks fine, and he was recently featured in a cinematic. If they knew Kennen would change, I think they would have done something about his appearance there. Nocturne, as we mentioned, might get some visual tweaks, just like Pantheon. I understand why Rammus is here, because he's simply old, but he doesn't look too bad, just like Skarner. And Skarner is in a good place story-wise, so I don't think he would be a priority. So, to sum up what we learned here, Udyr and Volibear will likely be next, but after that it is anyone's guess. I think that the Voidborn are coming after that, because there is so much potential in the new design. I mean, look at this. This is what Cho'Gath should be turned into. A black all-devouring horror. On top of this, we know what Vel'Koz actually looks like. This is the picture currently found on the universe. You can see that Vel'Koz was also redesigned to fit the new lore. So don't tell me the others will remain the same. Right now, Cho'Gath and Kog'Maw are like the comparisons between the advertisements and what you actually get. And right now, this doesn't look that appealing for today's standards. Hey, did you know that we have social media and Twitch where we talk about other league facts and stories? And did you know that we have neat mugs and shirts too? The links to all of that will be below. And as always, thank you, come again.